In this video, we'll be replacing spark plugs and tube seals in a Honda Pilot. First thing you're going to do is remove the engine cover. There are two flathead screws holding that on. Then you're going to disconnect the front engine coils. Just unplug those connectors. Then you're going to remove the 10mm nuts that are holding them on. If you're going to be reusing those coils, you want to make sure you set them aside in order so that they go back into the same spark plug tube when you reinsert them. Then you're going to remove the spark plugs. You're going to need a 5/8 inch spark plug socket and a 4-inch extension to reach down in there.
You want to check the gap. The gap spec is 39 to 43.
You're going to install the new spark plugs. He's putting some anti-seize on those threads just to keep them from backing out, holding them a little tighter. And you're going to tighten those to 15 foot-pounds each. You don't want to over-tighten those. You can easily break or ruin the threads if you over-tighten. You're going to then install those front engine coils and again put them back to the proper spark plug that you took them out of. The coil will be tightened down with those 10mm nuts to 7 foot-pounds. And you're going to remove the rear coils and the spark plugs.
Oh, we got oil in there.
Uh-oh.
That's not good. So the spark plug goes into the valve cover, into a tube, and there's a seal around the tube. That's part of the valve cover seal, and if that seal goes bad, it'll start to leak oil into that spark plug hole.
Because of that leak, we'll have to replace the tube seals, and we're going to show you how to do that in this video. First thing you're going to want to do is disconnect the breather hose for the intake. And then disconnect the intake boot. He's just loosening up the clamps so that he can pull the boot out. Just two 10mm bolts holding those. And he's going to disconnect the intake sensor and the throttle body. Just unplug those two sensors. And then he'll disconnect the emissions purge valve and just pull that tube off. Disconnect the brake vacuum hose. Then there's a breather hose and an intake runner for the electrical connection, and you just need to unplug that. He's using a little bit of a pry tool to pull that off. Be careful not to break that. Then you're going to remove the upper engine cover. There are 12 10mm nuts and bolts that hold that on. It's much faster if you have a power tool, but you can do this with a ratchet and a wrench. Then you'll need to remove the coolant hoses. There's 2 of them to the throttle body. You may need to use a pair of pliers to loosen up those clamps, to move them down to pull the hose off, and maybe a pair of pliers to loosen that hose. You'll see a little bit of coolant drip out when you do that. Then remove the coolant hoses to the throttle body. And remove the intake plenum. There are 9 nuts and bolts holding that. They're 12mm. You're going to want to make sure you put something, rags or something, down into those ports. You don't want anything falling in there. I'm going to disconnect the crankcase, the vent line from the valve cover, and then disconnect the coolant hose from the throttle body. Again, you might use a pair of pliers to loosen up that hose so you can pull it off. Then disconnect the variable valve timing solenoid. Just pull that connector off.
So this wiring harness has 2 bolts, 1 on each side. And to hold it down, you got to have a feel for them. The first one's right here. Just kind of pull this harness out of the cover. Just kind of snaps in, so you just pull it out. See, it's getting looser. And this power steering hose has a bracket with a bolt in the back here that you gotta get off. So you're back in this corner back here. So it's got like a release tab, like I'm plugging a electrical connector. Back here, there's 2 connectors. They're both for oxygen sensors. You just gotta kind of reach back there.
Then you're going to disconnect the oxygen sensors. There's 2 plugins there. You're going to unplug and remove the rear engine coils. Pull those out for the remainder of the coils there. Again, just 2 10mm bolts holding those down. Then you're going to remove the valve cover. There are 5 10mm bolts. He's using a mirror so he can see where the bolts are. Again, you can see the bolt there. And once you get those nuts out, you can remove the valve cover. Might need to pry that up a little bit to loosen it, and then you'll be able to pull that off.
There we go. These are the seals that didn't seal, they damaged.
You can spray in the tubes with brake cleaner and some compressed air to get clean that oil out of there.
So there's a little seam right here. So you apply just a little bit of silicone on it. when you put it back together so that it doesn't leak out of that little corner.
You want to make sure you clean all those surfaces off. You're going to remove the old seals out of the valve cover. He's using a prying tool there just to pull them out. And then install the new ones. He's just using a mallet and gently tapping those into place. Remove the old gasket from the valve cover and clean all of that out. Make sure you wipe that out. And install the new gasket. You'll line that up. You'll see how it sits in there. It's shaped to fit that valve cover. Just make sure you line up all the tabs. And then you can insert it and push it in. You're going to apply silicone to that little seam there. There's one in the front and in the back. And reinstall the valve cover.
So you got the tube and then you got the seal, and they're coming together, and I'm reaching down there with my finger and just kind of feeling around that tube to make sure that the seal goes down and doesn't get kittywampus or caught inside there. I kind of feel for it.
You're going to reinstall the 5 10mm bolts and torque those to 8 foot-pounds. Going to replug in those variable valve timing solenoids. Reconnect the harness and the oxygen connectors, and then tighten down that power steering bracket. 3 bolts there, 10mm to 8 foot-pounds. He's reconnecting those wire harnesses for the O2 sensors. Remove the rags that you had in there. Carefully cover those holes and use an abrasive pad to clean around that. Again, keep something in that hole while you're doing that. You don't want any of the debris falling in those holes. Install the new gasket over the intake ports. And then you're going to clean those intake ports on the plenum. Works great if you can use a disc, but you could also use an abrasive. Reconnect the coolant hoses. There are 2 of those, and the crankcase vent line back on the throttle body. And then just tighten down that hose clamp. Tighten down the intake plenum. There's going to be 9 nuts and bolts. They're 12mm, and you're going to tighten those down to 16 foot-pounds. Be sure and follow the sequence in this picture. You don't want to just tighten them around in any order. They need to be tightened in this order. Reconnect the breather hose onto the plenum. Reconnect the brake vacuum hose. He's using a red Scotch abrasive pad to clean up the surface, and then you're going to reinstall the upper engine cover. There are 12 nuts and bolts that came off of that. They're 10mm, and you're going to tighten those to 8 foot-pounds, almost 9. And again, be sure to follow the sequence that we're showing here in the video. Reconnect the intake sensor and the throttle body. The intake runner, I want to plug that back in. Reconnect the purge valve, hook that hose back up. Install the new spark plugs in the rear. And again, you're going to tighten those just to 16 foot-pounds. Make sure you don't over-tighten them. Reinstall those rear coils. Again, 10mm nuts to 7 foot-pounds.
Just putting a little bit of grease just to make it slide together a little bit easier, nicer.
You're going to reinstall the intake boot. There are 2 10mm bolts, and you're going to tighten those to 8 foot-pounds. Reconnect the breather hose to the intake. Then you'll install the engine cover. There are 2 flathead screws holding that in, and you're all set.